The Matrix Resurrections is the fourth entry in the Matrix series. Lana Wachowski returns to direct, as well as co-writing the film with David Mitchell and Alexander Heyman. Keanu Reeves returns as Neo, living in the Matrix again as Thomas Anderson. He's working as a video game developer and has trouble distinguishing the world of his Matrix video games from reality. When he realizes that he's trapped inside the Matrix and that Trinity is trapped here with him, he teams up with a new group of rebels and begins to fight back against Agent Smith in an attempt to free Trinity so they can both escape the Matrix. The Wachowskis have worked on a lot of really interesting projects since the original trilogy, some that worked out pretty well and others that didn't. After all this time and with Lana Wachowski coming back to direct, I was excited to see what new ideas the franchise might have to offer and how they might potentially move blockbusters forward in some meaningful way, the same way the original did. And while the potential is there, it ultimately ends up not reaching as high as I feel that it could have. The movie gets off to a pretty great first hour. I honestly have no problems with it. The acting is great, particularly from Keanu Reeves and Carrie-Anne Moss. You can see how enthusiastic everyone is to be back in this world and to have the chance to expand on it. The direction and cinematography are pretty good, as expected, for the most part. The music by Tom Tykwer and Johnny Klimek I thought was particularly good. While a lot of the story is retreading the same plot as the previous movies, it's really unique in the way that it's so self-referential. It addresses point blank how sequels and reboots are at risk of taking over Hollywood, even calling out its own studio by name for releasing one sequel and reboot after another, and deservedly so. The lengths to which it goes in its metafiction here in the first hour are impressive, and I really found it honestly kind of nerve-wracking to watch. I was genuinely uncomfortable in a really good way, watching this and imagining how fresh the story could have ended up being if they had committed to this line of thinking. But unfortunately, they abandoned these ideas. Around the hour mark, the story starts to settle into a much more predictable storyline for a Matrix sequel, one that feels more in line with the mindless action of the third installment. It feels like they tried to force in too many great ideas in the first half without any real idea of where they were going with them and how to emphasize them in the second half in a way that ended up meaning anything. And so at a certain point, they settled for a more predictable action movie plot, with Neo trying to save Trinity and take control of the Matrix, and all the more complex layers of the story that could have been really interesting to explore get stripped away in service of getting to a really predictable conclusion. The first half introduces a lot of potentially really interesting new characters like Bugs, played by Jessica Henwick. She's really fun to watch in her early scenes, and it's disappointing that the movie kind of forgets about her at a certain point. Same with pretty much all the other supporting characters. Yahya Abdul-Mateen offers a pretty cool new interpretation of Morpheus, but the second half doesn't really let him contribute to the story in any way. He and a lot of other supporting characters are just kind of there, contributing to the action sequences here and there, but not really adding any depth to the last hour of the movie when it really could have used it. Jonathan Groff is decent as a new Agent Smith, but his character's motivation goes through so many nonsensical twists throughout the movie that he becomes kind of tiring. Whenever he shows up, you just kind of get confused. Same with Neil Patrick Harris's character. Despite a big info dump halfway through the movie attempting to explain who he is, he never feels like a fully developed character. Keanu Reeves and Carrie-Anne Moss inhabit their characters really well as always, and they keep their storyline compelling for the most part. But even that sometimes gets forgotten about when the writers try to fit too much story into one movie. Some of this might have been forgivable if the action sequences were at all satisfying, but they're mostly forgettable. They're often shot way too close, with too much shaky cam and quick cuts that makes them difficult to see, which is a real disappointment given that all of the first three movies managed to avoid this. There's really none of the impressive choreography that made the original trilogy's action so satisfying. That or it was just shot so poorly that you can't see it and really appreciate it. There's also a moment halfway through when an action sequence gets ruined by a character from the original films showing up out of nowhere and giving some really ridiculous comic relief that adds nothing to the movie. After the first two Matrix sequels were a disappointment, it's a shame this one couldn't have been better. Even after all this time and with one of the original writers and directors on board to guide the project, we're still left with something that feels really unnecessary. It doesn't feel like the advancement in storytelling that it needed to. It had the potential with some really original ideas in the beginning that could have really disrupted the franchise in some compelling ways, but in the end it sells for being a predictable action movie, giving us nothing we haven't seen before. I was really looking forward to this movie, and it's a shame that it couldn't have been better. Again, it has a really solid first hour, but kind of falls apart in the second half. I give it a 5 out of 10. Thank you guys for watching.